Welcome to From the Spectrum podcast. This is a podcast about autism. It is my goal to explain what is autism. I intend to use a mixture of scientific literature, personal experience, and some opinion. With opinions, I will explain why I feel the way I do and give examples. I will provide links to various references for each episode. For each episode, we will discuss various aspects of autism. The From the Spectrum podcast will mostly avoid causes of autism, and I will try avoiding the increases of diagnoses of late. This is like playing tug of war with barbed wire, and I don't think I want to travel down that path. For today's episode, I will spend time discussing symptoms from the DSM-5 TR. These symptoms are crude and intends to capture the spectrum. In addition, I will provide personal examples, observations of others, and dialogue from others. First, a brief history of autism. In 1943, Leo Kanner published a paper in Pathology called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. This paper has been cited 17,738 times. This paper begins by mentioning observing these disturbances in 1938. A year later, in 1944, Hans Asperger, from Asperger's syndrome, published Autistic Psychopathy. This is the beginning of the phenomena. Autism is placed in the neurodevelopmental disorders of the DSM-5 TR. Some related disorders within this section includes OCD, which is a cyclical loop in the so-called cortical striatum thalamo circuit, involving the cortex, which is involved with executive functioning, planning, and running models about our world around us. The striatum, which is in the basal ganglia, in the so-called go, no-go area of the brain. The striatum is related to goal-directed motivation and habits that meet movement, motor movement. And the thalamus. I like to think of the thalamus like a skyscraper in a big city. Many various people are coming in the revolving door, and some are going to the same office, and some are going to different offices. But they all make a stay and have different objectives while there. At the same time, people are leaving through the revolving door and going to many different places about the city or the world. This represents the many downstream destinations for our circuitry. Now, with OCD, imagine someone constantly being stuck in the revolving door. Also, tics, Tourette's, speech and language, and schizophrenia. With schizophrenia, there are many shared social phenotypes. However, mainly, autism lacks the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, which includes delusions and hallucinations. Here, there is a common gene linked here in the striatum called catnap. Scientifically, it's called CNT-NAP2, and this is a protein that implicates the striatum. The catnap gene also implicates focal epilepsy, or focal seizures, which is sometimes related to autism. Also in the DSM-5, similar to autism, is schizoid personality disorder. which is a cluster A personality disorder. These are often referred to as odd and eccentric. Lastly, anxiety tracks common with autism. There are 3 levels of autism based on needed support. I am level 1, which requires support. There's level 2, requiring substantial support, and level 3 requires very substantial support. Now for the symptoms. Criteria A has 3 symptoms and is known as deficits in social communication and interaction. A requires all 3 symptoms from current functioning or a history of the symptom. And criteria B has 4 symptoms and known as restricted and repetitive behaviors. B requires 2 symptoms. In an episode of Peter Attia's Drive, featuring my favorite psychiatrist and neuroscientist, Carl Diceroth, Peter calls autism something with superpowers and superdeficits. I will provide a link to the section they discuss about autism, and we will parse that out when discussing criterion A. In the meantime, I believe the layperson and some professionals are hitched on criterion A. This is because it is easier to observe. And I have an opinion about humans' investigative tendency. It has come to my attention, humans love whatever makes sense to them, whatever they can make sense of. We get to a point and discover an answer, and that makes sense to us. And we say, yes, that must be it. Or yes, that is it. However, something must be causing whatever that discovery is. So, as we review these symptoms, I ask you to take notice of how restrictive and repetitive behaviors can complicate our socialness and relationships. The restricted and repetitive behaviors, mixed with a lack of opportunity and ability to understand socialness, causes a vast conundrum, a confusing paradox of socialness. I suspect criteria B causes criteria A. Maybe not entirely, because of some other factors we will discuss later. But a major contributor of the known social phenotype, perhaps all of these things happening in our thoughts and imagination are, or over time, become more and more interesting to us. And this is safer than the outside world. In the Diceroth podcast, Carl mentioned something very interesting to me. It is unknown if autism and whatever genetic mutations give the person the introverted phenotype for protection because of the sensory processing challenges, or if this is possibly learned at a young age, possibly in the so-called critical stage. Wonderful as usual by Diceroth. For context, as a psychiatrist, autism is one of his 2 specialties. In his words, described in his book, Projections, he wants to help this underserved population. He also accurately mentions there is no medical treatment for autism. It is my opinion we find our superpowers and do that. Something that might help is increasing the understanding of what is autism. Now let's review criteria B. We will first review B to understand how this could implicate criteria A. I do not feel A can implicate B. Well, besides people interfering with the following symptoms that we so much enjoy. These symptoms are not exhaustive, neither by the DSM or the ones that I add to the conversation. B1. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. Anytime you hear stereotypy, it is wrong. Stereotypy or stereotypy suggests purposeless behavior. This is a misnomer. There is purpose to these characteristics and movements. Other examples include simple motor stereotypies. Remember that closeness to tics. This is a localized energy from a buildup of something. And this causes concentration to relieve that buildup. The movements satisfy that. I enjoy squeezing and rocking. Other examples include hand flapping, nail and lip biting, hair twirling, clenching or grinding teeth, head banging, which I used to do as a child, and staring at objects. I like to rub my hands across each other, sometimes squeezing quite intensely, and sometimes rubbing softly. Or I like to rub my fingers across my palms. I like to squeeze my hands. I like wadding up paper towels into a ball and squeezing in my palm, especially the rough style paper towels. I often do this, including doing this during the entire time of the ADOS 2 Mod 4. I don't think this was caught during the assessment. I enjoy washing my hands with rough style soap. When COVID happened and the so-called experts said to wash hands for 20 seconds, I was confused. I thought that wasn't nearly enough time. And I thought that before, during, and after COVID. I thought it was 60 seconds. However, maybe this is just my preference and experience with washing my hands for longer than the 20 seconds. In short, maybe this is my creation. For clenching and grinding teeth, I do this. And I remember as a young child riding in a car, I would clench and grind teeth and only release them when we passed an electrical pole, or sometimes called a telephone pole. Anything in between, I had to be clenching my teeth. And it was very repetitive. It was almost necessary that I do this while traveling in the car. I am still fascinated with the rhythmic movements of the telephone poles coming at me and passing me while driving or riding in a car. Today, I occasionally still find myself doing the clenching and noticing the telephone poles passing by. Other examples include lining up toys or objects. I like to straighten everything in lines with perfect or similar gap or spacing. Everything in my work area, desk, table, I like to have those in order, stacked up neatly, with the edges matching, and everything spaced out just right. Other examples include flipping objects and echolalia. Echolalia is me. It allows me to process and learn. And when we discuss criterion A, we will go into echolalia a little bit more. People with echolalia can do this immediately, or long after, or both. About a year ago, while grocery shopping, I heard an old man while his wife put something in the cart. The old man had a country accent, and it was very capturing to me. And as his wife put something in the cart, the old man said, Well, go on, get you with you. In a very country-like accent. I don't know if it was the accent, the rare use of those words, or just a combination of it. But I was immediately hitched on this, and I said it to myself immediately. By the time I left the store, I must have said it dozens of times, eventually out loud. I went on to say this over and over again for about 6 to 8 months. So much that my 2 teenagers picked up on it and learned it, and they would randomly say it. Until a point, they had enough of it, and they said, "Dad, you can't do that anymore. We've had enough of it." I was reminded of a Seinfeld episode whenever they were doing this silly "hello" out of the side of their mouth, and eventually 1 or 2 of them just got tired of it, even though 1 or 2 of the others still wanted to continue it. People just get satisfied with something, and it's just time to move on. Sometimes with echolalia, it's hard to move on. It's almost like that cyclical loop. Now, B2, which is insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Examples include extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, which suggest no gray areas. Gray areas to me are complicated, unnecessary, and introduce many forms of interpretations. People with autism or autistics, we are very literal. We need context. We enjoy the context and structure. We have a strict obedience to rules, especially our own set of rules. Remember our routines. This is what works for us. For those wondering, if you have something to say to us, just say it. You don't have to beat around the bush or introduce it in gray areas. Just say it. We also have a tendency for perfectionism. Replaying events and conversations, we can overthink and overanalyze. This is a great source of anxiety, and how this trait implicates social life. Also, we miss sarcasm and humor. I tend to think about others in that, let me have it. You won't touch the degree of critic that I will have on myself, or likely that I already have had on my life, or on myself regarding whatever it is, topic, discussion, subject you want to talk about. Often, when people approach us for something wrong, we have already analyzed it and exhausted it. I ask you to consider that degree of pressure we have to fit in or adhere to those created social norms. Now we can consider how our routines are preferred and entangled in us, in our nervous system, either from birth or learned from experience at that early age. However, I suspect this allows me to live like B-movie, which is a sense of a superpower. About 10 or 15 years ago, an animated movie came out about bees called B-Movie. And it featured Jerry Seinfeld playing the main character. And he had a real close friend. They were adolescent in the movie, about to graduate high school or just graduating high school. And Jerry was discouraged about the life within the beehive. Everything was the same every day, and it operated with extreme efficiency. I don't think he liked that routine. And he wanted to do something different. As Jerry and his buddy B were talking, the camera panned out and it showed thousands or 100,000s, possibly a million bees buzzing around in extreme efficiency at high pace and such a perfect synchrony. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, this is how I live. This is how I view things, my sensations. And autism is essentially a sensory processing disorder. However, this allows for great efficiency and routine, and we eventually prefer that. Also, this suggests less room for negotiating with myself. I see it, I see the pictures and movie is flowing in my head, then I can overanalyze it and plan it and do it. I am very precise with my planning. I know the exact details. I will exhaust this out in my brain to perfection. However, sometimes, because how unpredictable the world is, especially from a social context, life doesn't work like that. Here, I am speaking about other people or situations complicating those plans or routines. Other symptoms include greeting rituals, a need for same route or travel, need for same foods every day. Oftentimes, people will prepare several items or sides for a meal, and this has always been strange to me. I don't quite understand it. I love the same clothes. I have several of the exact item. If it makes sense, it makes sense. I have severe B2. For me, this dampens my ability in socialness and certainly building and maintaining relationships. B3. Highly restricted, fixated interest that are abnormal in intensity or focus. First, dissecting abnormal. This suggests this can be a superdeficit. However, if known, if applied to your life, abnormal is definitely a superpower. This makes commitment nearly impossible in the social world, certainly challenging. This is another factor that lessens opportunity to develop social skills. A component with commitment is worrying about an out. And will the relationship interfere with our time alone, our time for our interest, the things that we would prefer to be doing? Also, I struggle with how easy others can act how they do. And what do I care about other trivial factors of their life? I don't mean this to be rude, it's just there are many other things more interesting to me. Other examples include a strong attachment to or a preoccupation with unusual objects. Unusual is a poor use of information. To me and others, it is a form of removing our interest so we can act more like you. Not interested. I think do better. I think that decision of using unusual is a hallmark example of someone or some people injecting themselves in what they consider normal, abnormal, or unusual. Find your superpower and do that. Another example is circumscribed or persevative interest. This is just repetitive behaviors. I am happy to provide a link to an episode from The Autistic Woman called Meet My Autistic Brain. She has a wonderful episode on this. That is a great podcast worthy of checking out. B2 and B3 are severe to me. However, having them and having them for most or probably all of my life, they are awesome and I wouldn't change it. As a young child in the mid-80s, around 5, 6, or 7, I was extremely fixated on the Vietnam War. I remember wanting to ask people about it, but in a way they wouldn't comment on my obvious, strong interest in it. That, and a combination of my poor speech and language, it was difficult. I could not form proper questioning that would extract the information I wanted about the Vietnam War while decreasing the risk of any comments made directed at me about this strong, fixated interest. It was very awkward for me. I remember that buildup of energy in my body, wanting to talk about it, the intensity of trying to ask about it, and the struggles of not getting it out at times. Still today, I can talk about the Vietnam War. Remember when I was a child in the 80s, it wasn't far removed, maybe 10 or 15 years after the Vietnam War. In the 3rd grade, I remember only wanting to write Vietnam novels. I would read children's versions of these books and piece together information that I did receive from other people and create my own Vietnam books. Fiction, of course. These intense fixations have never stopped. And they do get intense. Sometimes, in my history, they have implicated relationships and my social life quite severely. These fixations can happen and become so energized that I thought something else could be wrong. It is extremely intense with psychology and neuroscience. Our nervous system is so much. I wake up and do what is probably the normal waking up process other people have. Slow to wake, and eventually you come to and you're ready to do on your task and get your day started. 10 to 15 minutes after I wake, my brain is blasting out pictures as I provide dialogue to it, whatever interest that I'm in at that time or that morning. I am professing to myself, and I suspect my learning accelerates because of this. It is a wonderful phenomenon. It is a superpower. Then 15 to 20 minutes later, motor movements begin. I will stim more, move my hands as someone does when speaking. Then it intensifies to me moving my lips, and finally, I will speak it out loud while pacing, and often the pacing can intensify. It's like I am professing to a class on whatever topic, subject, or interest that I am in at that moment. I think this is indeed a method for that accelerated learning. Another personal example is I worked in an engineering department for about 10 years for a machining operation. Now, the machining operation would take raw materials and machine these down to certain dimensions. And each part had a blueprint with a few dozen dimensions listed on them, showing the nominal, usually in millimeters, and the tolerance level, in microns. And my department was responsible for cutting up the machining and cutting tools for the machines, the CNC and lathe type machines. So the cutting tools had their own sets of dimensions and tolerances. I got to a point where I can memorize both the part dimensions and tolerances and the cutting tool dimensions and tolerances. This allowed me to work at extreme efficiency at high rates of speed, so much that others thought I must be skipping steps. Superiors, co-workers, other departments, and other engineers, I was very entry level at this point, suspected that. And it got to a point where I would name off dimensions to them, and it took a while for them to accept that, to qualify that I was right, that what I was saying was indeed correct. And I thought, this is taking too many trials. I don't understand why it's just not believed. But with human social tendency of just speaking, often I think others just speak without providing much context to the conversation. Now back to the dimensions. It took too many trials, and I'm not the type of person, nor are other autistics or people with this social phenotype, to just say stuff, just to be saying stuff. This was very odd and a good example of how our superpowers aren't quite accepted, or they take longer to accept than what they should. However, this allowed me to work at that great efficiency, and I eventually made promotions, a few different promotions while working for this. This company is a very tall corporation, meaning there's layers into the hierarchy. There are many layers to the hierarchy, and I worked my way up quite a bit and had a decent job. In a future episode of From the Spectrum podcast, we will go into the anxiety and just the social exhaustiveness of the outside world, and including employment. Employment is very difficult. Lastly is B4, which is hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Apparent indifference to pain and temperature. Adverse response to specific sounds or textures. Excessive smelling or touching of objects. Visual fascination with lights or movements. This sensory input is it. This complicates socialness and eye contact. If you know, you know. Meaning, if this is you, you know. If this is not you, then you don't know. Visual sensations are like watching TV in fast forward, maybe 2.5 or 2 times speed. This is a wonderful example of superpower and superdeficit. So what? Socialness is hard, and making eye contact is hard. It's hard to keep up with. Socialness and eye contact are two different things. I am talking about superdeficits here. Before I continue, I will say this. Eye contact, as a component of socialness, is a very human thought and creation, meaning it doesn't impact the conveyance to me. So what if someone is not making eye contact with me while speaking to me? Speech and language, or speech and language and eye contact? If I could teach people one thing in life, a major consideration for this one thing would be never underestimate a human's capacity to think. How is that relevant here? That's a good question. It is relevant because as the receiver processes the spoken information, the receiver, at some point, you make a decision that the speaker isn't making eye contact, and therefore the message or the spoken words are implicated. But are they? Or is that created by the receiver? The eyes are for image forming and non-image forming parts of our biology. The ears are auditory. This suggests the use of eye contact is needed for conveying speech and language, and that is created from human thought. Questions or comments, please reach out. However, as I mentioned earlier about superpowers and superdeficits, these visual inputs, along with other sensations, provide opportunity for extreme efficiency. It allows opportunity for increased processing and visualized thought and seeing things in real time and prior to things happening. You might often hear about pattern seekers or pattern thinkers with autism. So if you think about visual thinkers and pattern thinkers, think about those hyperconnected sensory processes. After all, it seems autism is simply a sensory processing phenomena. And I like that. In some cases, or maybe most cases, autism spectrum disorder can be considered autism spectrum phenomena. As a side note, because my tribe often have trouble with marketing and advocating for ourselves, From the Spectrum podcast offers t-shirts. Right now, we have one saying From the Spectrum podcast and one saying Autism Spectrum Disorder with disorder marked out and phenomena written under it. Look out for more information on these. Now, mostly I have talked about visual sensations. Mainly humans have a dynamic visual system. The eyes are indeed brain. The eyes are not an independent connection to the brain, and we certainly use the eyes to navigate the world. Now, as mentioned with B2 and B3, I have severe B4 as well. As we wrap up today's episode on criteria B, I asked you to understand how these symptoms implicate our ability to socialize and build and maintain relationships. If you know someone with autism or in a relationship with someone with autism, please understand this. You often cannot see criteria B. It is very hard to discover from the outside, as a spectator, and to investigate. In future episodes, we will review scales and tools associated with criteria B. Please consider the various challenges discussed today. And thank you for listening to the first episode of From the Spectrum podcast.